and welcome to A-Team Group's webinar on how to apply innovative e-com surveillance while ensuring control, compliance, and enhanced productivity. My name is Sarah Underwood. I'm an editor here at A-Team Group, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Our expert speakers today are Jordan Ho, Global Head of Commerce Surveillance IT at TP ICAP, David Cowland, Independent RegTech Advisor and Specialist in Compliance Change Programs covering Trade and Communication Surveillance, and Garth Landers, Director of Global Product Marketing at Theta Lake. Okay, first some information how you can make best use of today's webinar. To the right of your video screen, you'll see a Slido panel. There's a section for questions, which you can put in whenever you want. We'll take questions throughout the webinar. So if you have questions for our speakers, do please put them there and we'll pick them up as we go along. The other section is for polls. We'll be running 3 poll questions today. So do please answer those so we can get some gauge on how the industry is thinking about some of the topics we're talking about. Okay, enough of me. So let me ask our speakers to introduce themselves. Jordan, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your interest here.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Jordan Ho. Currently heading up the communication surveillance technology team at a very well-known inter-dealer broker. I'm sure you guys can find out which one that is. I have a keen interest in communication surveillance. I've been living and breathing this for the past 8 years of my career, and I've been moving from being a compliance officer into compliance change and now into technology. So these topics and the topics of discussions all through today touches me very, very closely.
Okay, thank you. David, over to you.
Likewise, I've been involved in the RegTech space for quite some time, advising across industry. I've got that kind of practitioner experience in the communication surveillance and trade surveillance space, quite passionate about some of the things that we need to do and how we move things on from a compliance perspective.
Thank you. And Garth? Oh, you've got your mute on, Garth. We can't hear you.
Sorry about that.
No worries. Thank you.
I'm Garth Landers. I'm responsible for product marketing here at Theta Lake. And my experience in this sphere goes back all the way back to the email days. So I've been an independent advisor and consultant analyst at Gartner Group, and of course, a vendor here today, and look forward to hearing from the panel and from the audience and hear what they think about today's modern communications challenges.
Excellent. Thank you all very much indeed. And let's get started this time with an audience poll. The question is, which of these collaborative e-commerce platforms are used at your organization? Obviously, there are a lot, so you can tick as many boxes as you feel are appropriate for your organization. And while you answer the question, let me come to Jordan to set the scene and tell us about the most used collaborative e-commerce platforms at financial institutions, and I can't say that, institutions, and why these platforms are particularly popular.
Yeah, so it's quite an array of different platforms out there at the moment. I don't know if I can speak to every organization because I think every organization is different, but specifically for mine, there's 5 on the list that touches what we use on a day-to-day basis. And I'll start from the most popular to the least popular. Teams is quite relevant to, I think, every organization now. It's an enterprise level. We certainly use it a lot. It focuses on collaboration, which is great, increased productivity across all different teams and functions. And the best thing about it from a commercial point of view, from the vendor's commercial point of view, is that it comes with additional packages, right? So anyone who has the parent company's packages installed or implemented in the company, Teams often comes with that as part of that toolkit as well. So Bloomberg is obviously the next one that is quite used. Bloomberg Chat, deeply rooted in trading, comes from a long history. I think originated back in 1982 when Michael Bloomberg first set up the company. We use it for trading. We use it to make markets. WhatsApp is also on the up and coming. We use that quite a lot where I am today. The main benefit for that is free and it's open to all users. So why not use it, right? There's a greater outreach to anyone on the other side of that chat channel. It's convenient, it's mobile, but there is a change in that game where it's currently going to be free, but obviously Meta will know about the requirements coming from a business and a financial institution's perspective. And there are talks about WhatsApp business coming out as part of that as well to facilitate specific requirements for business purposes. Symphony is the other channel that we use quite a lot. A challenger to Bloomberg in my eyes. Started out by a consortium of banks originally because I think it's much more cost effective. It provides messaging, but interestingly, it also allows the ability to customize and develop your own apps specific to your organization. And I think that's why it's gained quite a lot of popularity in that respect as well. So if you've got really kind of niche and company specific processes that you want to customize an app for, you can actually do that through Symphony. And finally, we also use Slack. Again, it's collaboration focused. It's a bit like Teams. In fact, I see it as a competitor to Teams myself, and I think it's more prevalent in the technology teams and less prevalent in front office and trading and broking, but still a tool that's quite used quite a lot in our organization.
Thank you. That's plenty to be going on with. Garth, what do you see when you're out there talking to customers? Is that a similar kind of mix? What else do you see?
Yeah, it is, certainly. I mean, we're just to echo Jordan, we're certainly seeing, these virtual meeting and collaboration platforms exploding in growth, right? This was a trend that was happening before the pandemic, and obviously the pandemic accelerated this trend. So we see similar application adoption, Teams, Zoom, Slack, Ring Central as well, Cisco WebEx. Obviously, we see, the use of SMS and WhatsApp. The chat applications that Jordan outlined of instant message applications like Bloomberg have always been very popular. And so organizations have just a multitude of channels across text, voice, increasingly video. I think, what we're seeing and why they're so popular is that in addition to sort of the real-time communications, they're really starting to replace and become the virtual office, right? The cloud-based digital workplace that we've been talking about for years. The ability to share files, share links, collaborate in these workspaces. We've really seen just a different way of people adopting these as a virtual workplace. And then there's another trend that's taking place as well, and that's what you might call sort of the meshing of these applications. So, today you might be in a Slack environment, as Jordan outlined, texting back and forth, chatting across, one-to-one or one-to-many, and then be able to, with this push of a button, schedule a Zoom meeting, right? So these different platforms are starting to interact, and in addition to users traveling across different modalities, whether it's voice or video or text, SMS with WhatsApp, they're also crossing applications. So I think that's some of the reason why they're so popular, right? They're just so feature rich, and you're capable of expressing so much, whether it's through emojis or reactions, that it's just changing the way people work.
Okay, fantastic. Let's see what our audience is using. Maybe we see the results of the poll, please. Okay, not quite as we expected. Jordan, what would you say to that?
I'm not surprised Zoom's coming out on top. I remember that at the beginning of the pandemic, everyone was downloading Zoom. I was talking to my mum using it. I'm sure many companies have adopted that as the pre-default tool. I think Teams coming slightly under, mainly due to the way that it was released, and I think there was a few nuggets where it was being fine-tuned before mass adoption came along. Zoom had that slight, head start. So yeah, it's kind of what I see playing out in my head as well.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. And bringing you in here, David, please would you outline the regulatory compliance requirements of collaborative e-commerce platforms?
Well, fundamentally, it's about recording all of the communications that regulated individuals are using. It comes under the market abuse regulation. There's some stuff in the States around immutability. They have a kind of, I think it's section 17(4)(a), where you're not allowed to change any of the communications, and that does create some challenges in firms and for some vendors who supply e-coms. But fundamentally, you've got to record the communication so that if a market abuse incident occurs, you have the ability to go to the communications and check that regulated individual and to see what they have said and what they have done.
Okay. Garth, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just echo that, these workplace communications, some of these laws, like, SEC ones, for example, as David mentioned, SEC regulations go back to the 1930s in the United States, right? So these laws and regulations have adapted over time. We've seen it sort of evolve from written communications to email to chat and instant message to voice. And now increasingly it's spanning, mobile communications as well. So it's not hard to see where this might go. You can look at this cycle and the regulatory landscape, and it's been quite active, as we've seen with mobile communications, and enforcement and monitoring of that is needed. So it's not hard to imagine that in the future, we'll start to see this, improve or start to encompass things like video as well, right? So it's always evolving. The workplace is evolving, and these laws are often broad enough that they can support that, right? Both in the compliance and legal spheres as well.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. And let's run another audience poll here, if we may. This one asks, what am I saying? Yes, I'm saying here. Are we going to run another poll? No, we're not. Sorry, I made a mistake there. Yes, we are. Sorry. There we go. That's what are the challenges of using these econ platforms at your organization. Sorry, a bit confused there with questions and polls. So let's run that one. You answer as many of tick as many of the boxes as you like. And while you do that, let me come back to Jordan, if I may, to talk about how he sees the challenges here.
Yeah, I certainly think that there are a lot of platforms. I think Garth mentioned it earlier, and there is a trend towards aggregating those and combining it. So that is a known problem where vendors out there are trying to solve. Why use multiple kind of client messaging platforms when you can just go to one and it federates it out to whoever's on the other end? It could be WhatsApp, it could be Teams, but the point is you send it through one channel. The other thing I think is when you've got all various different types of comms channels, you're also going to have to manage the releases that comes with these different channels, right? So let's say you've got seven e-commerce platforms out there. Every time the vendor makes an update and there's a new functionality or a new feature, you're going to have to keep up with what the impact of that is, whether it brings along a new way of communicating in the example of new emojis, or does it kind of regress any existing controls that you have to monitor or to record it. You have to be on top of that and to understand what's coming out, test it, and then learn, and then make sure your controls are adapting to it as well. Roadmap input as well, just on the theme of releases and features. Every organization's got a specific way of working, and being able to make sure that whatever platform is in front of you caters to that, you'll need to have some sort of relationship with the vendor. Most of the vendors are quite big of those platforms, and it's hard for them to focus specifically on any client requirements. In fact, what they tend to do is to look broadly and say, right, these are the most popular kind of problem statements. How do we then solve those? If you're a smaller fish in that pond and you have a really hard requirement, it's difficult often to get heard from those vendors to make sure it gets delivered. And also just the problem of remembering what to use and who to use it for. You might have people using platform one for one thing. You might have someone in finance using platform two for another thing. It gets all very confusing and messy, right? So I think those are the typical challenges that come with it.
Thank you. David, what would you say there?
Well, I think I'll take down the compliance route, because I don't see that the front office has too many challenges. They just use whatever they can, and what will drive their revenue. And if their client wants to contact them via a new communication mechanism, they want that picked up as quickly as possible by the organization. I think the challenge comes in multiple forms with the compliance team. It's one, being proactive enough to stay ahead of what new communication channels are arriving, so that they're aware of them rather than being reactive. And then the second challenge becomes, just as Jordan was saying, the plethora of e-commerce channels. When an incident occurs, that's when the problem really comes. And if you sit down with the compliance officers and have been there when they go through an incident and they need to check, you see somebody with, say, 2 screens, and those screens have 10, 12, 15 applications open, right? They're looking at Zoom, they're looking at WhatsApp, they're looking at emails, they're looking at order management, they're looking at trade systems, they're looking at research, they're looking at Bloomberg chat. All these systems in kind of the old way of doing things is that they have all those open as they're trying to check all of that individual's messages. And that is really hard when you're trying to stitch together whether the trade surveillance issue or potential market abuse issue that's popped up is actually real. How do you track that through? And that becomes a real challenge for the compliance teams to sort of be able to monitor that and go through that and actually find that needle in the haystack.
Okay, thank you. And Garth, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I would echo, obviously the volume and velocity of these sort of new communication types. You have to really feel some compassion for your compliance teams and departments, right? This can be a nightmare in terms of being overwhelmed with just the sheer data volume and the fact that there are so many different channels, as both Jordan and David mentioned. And I think one of the challenges that organizations really face today too is that the IT and infrastructure department that was built for this initially, and the providers, really take the old hammer and nail analogy, right? If the only tool you have is a hammer, everything you see as a problem tends to be a nail, right? And that is echoed with email archiving systems, because for many of us, we have supervision, surveillance type legacy tools and legacy archives that were built for email. And the convenience factor for those providers, not for you, the user, is they're going to treat every type of new modality and communication type, written communication, as an email. So this means in many cases that when it's getting to that compliance team that David was mentioning, they're going to see all of these new forms of communications sort of chunked up into email messages, and they're going to lose the format, they're going to lose the fidelity, they're going to most importantly lose the context. So it's going to be really hard to ascertain and piece together the different elements of a conversation, which in a chat conversation, right, it's persistent. It can go on, over days, weeks, months, probably someday years, right, when we'll be able to piece that together because you have a chat box open and you interact with that person and it's a continued conversation. If you segment those into emails and you try to piece that together, it becomes really challenging. So that sort of legacy infrastructure, legacy technology approach, also presents challenges for the compliance personnel that are trying to identify risk in this, needle in a haystack environment, as David mentioned.
Okay, that's great. Now, no more slippage here, and let's see the poll results. Get this right. Garth, would you like to comment on those?
Yeah, so the challenges of these econ platforms, too many platforms, right? So, this is not surprising, right? Because I think one of the first things IT did and organizations did when the pandemic hit was, how do we make everyone productive? How do we get everybody enabled? How do we empower them? Rush out, support all of these platforms. And now we're in a mode where organizations are really starting to take a deeper look at the compliance and security needs, hopefully not playing catch up, but trying to figure out what these platforms are best at, maybe taking a best of breed approach. We say compliance across all platforms is a big number too. That makes sense because, again, this is the way we work now. Lack of consistency. That's an interesting one. And that might mean different things, right? In terms of the way you interact with a Zoom, a Teams, a Slack, a Cisco WebEx is a different learning experience and different functionality. So, or it could be lack of consistency in terms of capability. So you see that. And then lost data and misuse. Everything all sort of stands out here as pretty significant, right?
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And Garth, staying with you, what approaches can firms take to ease these types of challenges and limitations and maximize the value of e-commerce platforms while maintaining control and compliance? Because that obviously seems quite an issue. A lot of platforms, compliance becomes difficult.
Yes, it does. So I think if whether you're in IT, but particularly in IT, you've got sort of a balancing act, the juggling act to really master. And you've got on one hand, the need to support users, empower them, make them productive, delight them, as people say, support these different platforms. That IT person also has, the need to support their internal customer, compliance, surveillance. And so they're getting conflicting messages and different requirements from each stakeholder. That can be hard. Similarly, compliance, they don't necessarily want to say no to, every new application that pops up in the organization, but it can become the default behavior to say, no, we're not going to do that. Or if we do it, if we do embrace virtual meetings, we're going to turn off key functionality like in-message chat or things like that. So, it's easy to say no, it's easy to run away, but ultimately we need to support everybody, right? We can't take sort of a binary approach. And by that, how to be successful would encompass understanding what users want to do. If you don't support the users, as we've seen by recent headlines, they're going to do it anyway, right? If you have unsanctioned, unmonitored channels, that's going to be a risk. So you want to have those platform sanctioned, endorsed, put forth with standards and controls in place. You want to embrace the functionality that those users are looking for. And at the same time, you want to make compliance happy and productive. So in terms of how to do that, if you're looking at it from a provider landscape, you're looking at all of these different new channels that are out, these different platforms, whether it's Teams or Zoom or WhatsApp. And you've got to find those providers that are tightly integrated, that partner, that support, and that continue to evolve. As Jordan mentioned a while back, these platforms have continuous updates. They're cloud-based. They're always iterating, always putting forth new functionality. So when you look at a compliance provider in the tech landscape, they've got to be able to keep up. They can't simply just sort of take a one-size-fits-all approach and just archive everything or just treat everything as an email. So you've got to look for that dynamic partner that recognizes, fits today's way of working and is continually evolving.
Okay, thank you. David, how would you approach this and try and overcome some of these challenges?
I'm going to go even further and push the boat out a bit and say, I think the first thing is firms have got to understand they can no longer do this stuff with people. And by that, I mean like the heavy lift, that sense that you can do compliance monitoring on the comm side with people has got to go away. You have to have a strategy that says we now need technology to do the heavy lift. Technology's got to do that data grinding for us. If you're any size firm, you're getting 300,000 emails and hundreds of thousands of other messages. It is impossible for a person to go through that stuff. So firms have got to first of all go, this can no longer be done by compliance people, the heavy lift. We need the compliance people to do the insight and to do the clever stuff. That's what we pay them for. So if you sort of make that shift and say, that's what we're going to do, where we now need to move to a tech heavy lift and then have compliance as a layer. After that, you've got to think, well, how are we going to do this? Because this is large. This is not going to go from an inefficient manual process today to perfect tomorrow when you run a project. This has got to be a journey. And so firms have got to start thinking, right, how do we approach this? What is our strategy? What is our reg tech strategy? How are we going to move this? How are we going to tackle our priorities? So it's a little bit about recognizing that humans can't do this stuff anymore, right? At the fundamental level, and then working out how the strategy fits in a technology solution that can then start pulling in these e-comms platforms, which are only going to proliferate more and more. The problem right now today, there may be a burning fire you need to put out, but you've got to have a view going forward, and you've got to plan it out, and it will take time. Do not think you have a process that is manual and is probably about 20% efficient, and then tomorrow, after a 6-month project, it will be 100% efficient. That's not going to happen, because the market is still evolving, the reg tech vendors are still evolving. It's that thing I often say is, you suddenly turn the light on, and those 300,000 emails, you can now see which ones you need to be looking at. Except now there's 3,000 of them. Whereas before you were just stumbling around in the dark. Now you've got 3,000 emails to look at, and you go, we haven't got a team to look at 3,000 emails. So you've got to go back to your vendor and say, right, so how do we now then prioritize these 3,000 that we can see? And that's what you often find is as compliance teams go through these steps, there's also that jump from sort of like 0 to hero, whereas actually it's a step change, and you've got to tackle each part of the problem and have that strategy to get you to that ultimate goal. But it has to be a journey, and it will be a journey of probably many years. But you prioritize, you put a strategy in place, you recognize what your teams can and can't do, and you drive towards it.
Excellent. Thank you both. And coming back to you again, Garth, we've mentioned a little bit about the technologies. What types of technologies and tool solutions and services are helpful here, and how exactly do they work?
Yeah, well, just building on David's point too, I just want to carry that forward a little bit in terms of, humans alone can't do it. One of the things that we found in surveying our users and the regulatory landscape is that, for some time, right, we've been hearing about machine learning and, AI and all of these amazing technologies. And again, David pointed out, it's not going to be a panacea. It's not going to solve everything. But I think the thing that's really happening in the marketplace that's fascinating, most of the organizations we encounter are already doing, and using and leveraging some form of assistive AI, in the form of machine learning. They're either testing it, trialing it, starting to play with it in sort of a sandbox. They're actually using it in production, and many, have really embraced it. And that's the majority. So it's no longer really at the, far out visionary, 3 to 5 year sort of horizon. It's being leveraged today. And as David mentioned, it's part of the toolbox, right? People are still going to continue to use older approaches, with lexicon-based approach, random sampling, and they have to, right? And that's something they're comfortable with. But as part of that toolbox, they should start to really look at assistive AI and start to reinforce, that review, that surveillance, that supervision workflow, so that you can really scale. You can't do it. The days of planning to review thousands of emails a day, hundreds of thousands per month, and then, potentially millions per year as a department, that's not only over, that's also accompanied by, more voice, chat, IM, all of the things we've talked about today. So you really have to look at that. You asked about sort of the technology sort of kit, and what do organizations do? What can they do? What's the art of the possible? I think you can really look at it in sort of a workflow type phase. And if we think about it from the content, the platform approach that we're embracing today, think about capture, think about surveillance, and think about archive. And that capture piece is really important, right? You need to be able to look across all of these different platforms today, whether it's Teams, Zoom, Cisco WebEx, Ring Central, Slack, WhatsApp. You might have all of these and more, including, your instant message platforms like Bloomberg and email and all of those things. So, think about those capabilities and look for vendors that can support those in their native format, preserving that context and fidelity we talked about. At the surveillance layer, again, having that flexible workflow, being able to support organizations that might have, at the small level, two people in a review cycle might have 5 dozens. You might have hundreds of reviewers. You might have enormous teams dedicated to surveillance and review of your Ecomm. So having that capable, flexible workflow capability, but also being able to support all of these different modalities, being able to integrate and utilize the assistive AI that we talked about is going to be really important. And then it's sort of the end phase in terms of, those regulatory requirements that are around retention and long-term archiving. Everything used to be built from that perspective long ago, right? We thought in terms of email archives, and that's still an important component, but the way that we retain and preserve information is changing. The SEC even gave updates to SEC 17A4 in the last week, around the sort of gold standard for records immutability. So we see that that's changing, and it's not to mean that that's not an important component, but again, that's something you want to look at that's going to support your cloud environment, your cloud infrastructure, that you don't want to get locked into a particular vendor. You don't want to have them hold your data hostage. And you don't want to get trapped in sort of a, storage-based, fee-based model that, that vendor is passing their storage and operations costs onto you. So those are some things to think about.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Jordan, as a practitioner, where do you see the practicalities of technologies, and which do you think are most useful?
Yeah, I think technology, going back to both Garth and David's points, technology is there to assist the business, both the business and compliance, in automating a lot of the heavy lifting in order to refocus, your team on better value add, as David mentioned earlier. On that note, when it comes to the tools or technologies or solutions, the first thing you probably need is a team who understand that that's necessary, and a team with the right level of experience as well and expertise. A team made up of technologists who know how to use these solutions that's out on the market, compliance experts who know how to provide the use cases for the technologists to be able to configure those systems to be set up correctly, and also the business expertise to talk about the behavior of the profile of the types of people that the compliance team are monitoring as well, because behavior is the key thing here when it comes to risk. And if we're talking about problems and finding solutions to those problems, it's all about the individual person's behavior, whether you've got a good egg or a bad egg. And I think something that just came out towards the end of September, which I think, if we're talking about problem statements, that should be mentioned, is that one of the biggest US regulators went out and fined 710 mil collectively, 11 different organizations. I won't obviously name those organizations, but it's a big statement by the regulator. In fact, they came out to say that the era of evasive communication practices are over, right? They will hold us accountable. They'll hold you accountable for not being able to record and monitor Ecomms. And when we're talking about innovative Ecomms platforms, things like the social messages, medium platforms, you have new things coming out like deleting messages or disappearing messages, right? How are we as an industry going to tackle those types of things? Even the existing problems of surveilling images and non-English language, so foreign language that your lexicons aren't set up to detect, those things aren't easy to automate. You still need some level of human expertise to be able to configure those systems to make sure they're up and running correctly. So I think the problems of today are quite clear. I think the regulators have made that quite clear. You need the team out there within your own organization to help you put together. I think for me, and based on my experience, the technologies that obviously help with that, Garth mentioned capture and archive. I'm going to touch on those things in a bit more detail. I think you need to have from your source points as well, your platforms that you're talking through, or you're sending messages through. You need to have to ensure that there's end-to-end, what I call chain of custody. So if it passed through certain goalposts into the capture servers before it lands into your archive, you need to have checkpoints across the way to make sure that nothing's lost. And that comes back to data integrity. Once it goes into your archives, you need to be able to check that and be confident that there's completeness of data. The data is also accurate, which is different from completeness. Completeness talks about whether the data structure is there. Accuracy is whether the information is correct as at the point it was at the source, and also the timeliness of that data as well. How quick it takes for you to land it into the archive. Is it a T+1? Is it a T+7? Are you running any manual ingestion processes that take a lot longer for that information to come through. Consistency as well. There's no good in having a gold standard on a certain set of communications where on another platform there's a wild difference. You're getting T+1 for something but T+7 on something else. Security is also critical. Being able to make sure your business communications are locked down and can't be exposed by any external threats. And finally, auditability. You want to be able to show and demonstrate in your archives who's accessed that data, when they've accessed it, and what they potentially used it for. And this comes back not just to the regulations in the financial services, but it also touches on things like GDPR and data privacy as well. So finding an archive that nods to all of those points, I think, is quite critical. And coming into surveillance, a lot of the data going into surveillance platforms are based on what's available in your archive if you have that set up. So source, capture, archive, and then your surveillance monitoring. If the data is not coming into your archives correctly, it will not go into your surveillance tools correctly if you have that set up. Rule-based detection, I think someone mentioned it earlier as well, it's going to be there. It gives that blanket, that comfort blanket, which I think is also necessary to a certain extent. AI is great, and I'll talk about AI in a second, but the rule-based stuff really gives you confidence in black and white as to whether or not something is being detected or monitored. Your AI stuff will be the additional armory on top of that to really bring it up to the next level. But then guess what? AI is also based on the data set you have available. The more data you have, the better you can impose supervised training to that AI for it to understand your organization's way of working and the lingo that's used in your company as well, because every organization is different.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And we've covered quite a lot of ground. Coming to you, David, and putting together some of the things we have talked about. Please could you provide some guidance on how to implement these types of solutions, texts and so on into an existing surveillance environment? Because obviously things are, as you say, there, more and more devices, more and more things to track. How can you put it all together with an existing environment?
I think some of this depends on where you are as an organization. A little bit what Jordan was saying, I wouldn't jump straight to AI if you're still doing stuff manually. It depends where, and I also wouldn't worry about the solution. There is a solution out there. First of all, what is the problem you're trying to solve? What are you being hammered by that you need to tackle? Because the likelihood is it's not your entire surveillance process. The likelihood is there's one of them that you've been pulled up on or you have identified as a problem. So you've got to really understand that problem that you're trying to solve, because you're not going to solve everything at once. Like we said before, it's going to be a bit of a journey. So first of all, before we go on solutions, let's start understanding where the problem really exists and where we want to
You're breaking up a bit,
For that,
David.
you kind of need an idea of where your strategy is, and also what you... Yeah, a little bit. Is it back now?
Yeah, it's better. Thanks.
Okay. You need to know where you're going, right? And you need to know your business case. If you're going to get this signed off by the execs, you have to be able to justify where you're going. So I think the first thing is trying to understand the problem. I think after that, your tech team will help with a lot of the points that Jordan mentioned, and they're all valid points in terms of where your data is coming from, how it's feeding through to the solution that you've chosen, what regulations you're committed to making, and how many side channels it's coming from. And what I mean by that is not every organization has an email or a Zoom or a Teams solution that is rolled out globally or centrally, and so suddenly you're storing stuff in different places in different regions and you haven't brought it all together. So there's multiple things you need to sort of like work out, but that your tech team should supply. From a compliance perspective, is about understanding what the problem is and where you're trying to head.
Okay, fantastic. Let's take a little bit of time out and take some audience questions, if we may. The first one and most popular today is perhaps I could put this one back to you, David. It says, how would the panel suggest we can prioritize the most risky e-coms content? And then if anybody else wants to add, please feel free. So prioritizing the most risky e-coms content.
So that will be why is that a problem for you, right? Now in recent years, what people have probably seen is Zoom suddenly becomes a completely unknown, and people don't know how to monitor it. And what they don't want to do is watch sort of 200 hours of Zoom calls. So how are we doing that? Whereas email, there's a lot of lexicons out there, a lot of rules, you can kind of filter down emails. So how are we tackling Zoom? And there are a lot of tools starting to come out in terms of, especially with the AI, about rather than watching an hour-long Zoom call, your AI can pick out where the particular problems are within that call and say to you, look, there's 2 minutes in the middle of this call that is the problem. That's quite complex to implement, and it's quite complicated overall in terms of the AI. But I think it's understanding what your actual problem is, right? Is it Bloomberg Chat? Is it Teams? Is it Zoom? Is it email? In my experience, it at the time, the organization wanted to look at Zoom because we were going into the pandemic and everyone was like, how are we going to look at this? So I think it's understanding where the problem is, where from a compliance perspective you think you may be falling down, and then focusing on that one as the priority.
Okay, that's great. Coming to you, if I may, please, Garth. This one asks, to what extent can machine learning really reduce false positives or alerts, or however you like to describe them?
Yeah, it really goes to, as David mentioned, when you're talking about AI, the data that goes into it, right? With solutions today, and of course ours, they've been tested, utilized, worked against enormous volumes of relevant industry data, right? So, you want to look at providers that have a strong background and experience in your industry. If you're in financial services, you want to have those sort of machine learning enabled applications that are expert and trained to locate and identify, relevant risk-laden data sets in that enormous, volume of communications that you're sifting through. You don't want to be a guinea pig, a testing environment for a vendor, right? You want to be able to have some confidence and ability that that the tool is going to be able to support your needs. And I think we also have to make sure we're looking at machine learning in the context of not a be-all end-all as an assistive technology, that it's still going to be part of the review process. Ultimately, it's designed to help you identify and look at that data set. You're still going to look at it to some extent, and you're also going to be using other tools to call down and identify, potentially risk-laden data, whether that's lexicons, certainly, as well as, random sampling. So all of those things in conjunction can help you reduce the false positives. And, those also, as David mentioned, are increasingly used. That AI, machine learning, is used against video content so that you don't have to review and look at hours and hours of video footage, but instead can find when someone did a screen share, when someone shared a file, when someone used a phrase or uttered something that potentially violates policy.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you very much. And one for you here, Jordan, something that you mentioned earlier. It says, with a number of different comms devices in use, how best can we be sure that all data is secure? It came up on our poll also as an issue, not an enormous one, but compared to others, but still an issue.
Yeah, it really depends on the type of platform and how it's set up. I do come from a tech background, so I apologize if I get too deep into the technology here, but I'm going to stay high level. You can have a vendor hosted platform on their cloud solution known as a SaaS model, or you can have it hosted internally on your own cloud, or you can completely have it over the internet, right? So they have it in their own environment and you just access it directly. Very similar to the first scenario I described, but most of these ones I'm describing right now are free. Things like Zoom, where you don't necessarily need an account to be able to use it. There's no service fee you're paying for it. It's free and it's open, a bit like WhatsApp as well. So with that type of platform, you need to ensure, if you're going to let your business use it, that it's thoroughly tested and it's gone through the right controls. It needs to go through typically a governance committee, from what I'm used to, right? So you need to get the right legal personnel involved, and you need to have the right people from the cybersecurity involved and from client compliance involved. Everyone needs to do their fair share of testing the different use cases, because every organization is different again, and then reviewing what the outcome of those test cases are, and then you can then derive hopefully an informed decision based on whether those outcomes are acceptable to you as an individual or as an organization, sorry, or not. And if it's not, then is it risk accepted, or do we move on and say, actually, thanks, but no thanks, we're not going to be using this platform? I think with the way technology is growing these days, it would be prudent for all organizations to do thorough testing on the security of data. You don't want to be on the front of a tabloid newspaper announcing you've just leaked out millions of records of sensitive information, for sure.
Okay, thanks. Let's just take another couple and then we'll come back to my questions. And David, you might be able to help here. It's something that we have sort of covered. And it asks, we're reviewing our e-commerce devices and surveillance. What would the panel suggest as a strong approach that will last into the future?
If they're, I think it's going to be hard telling the front office not to use something. I always find that quite amusing when compliance teams try sort of stepping up and saying to the revenue generators, right, we don't want you to use this communication channel, and they're kind of like, well, no, we are going to use it. So I think you've got to be careful that with that approach. I think more you've got to work out what the priority is first, in terms of what you want to monitor, and probably in the area that you are most concerned with, and then set those priorities and work towards them. There's no point. It doesn't necessarily have to do everything. If you've got a communication channel that's only got a few users on it, you can probably still carry on doing it manually. But if you've got 800 people on something and it's being used heavily, that's probably where you want to focus. And if you have any concerns about any of the systems that are being used and your ability to monitor them effectively, they need to go to the top of the list. But I'd be careful about reviewing a list and then trying to say to the front office, we don't want you to use these.
Okay, we could spoil the party completely. Excellent. One more for you, Garth, if you like. It may be Jordan then who wants to perhaps pick up on this one as well. It asks, in your experience, to what extent do regulators expect innovative comms surveillance methods to be utilized by medium to small firms? I guess the question is, can they get away without doing it? Do you want to take that one, Garth?
Yes. So the question was in terms of what can regulators expect?
Yeah. Is your experience that the regulators expect small and medium-sized firms to use these kinds of more modern technologies?
Yeah, I think the experience with regulators is that they are, right, that it doesn't really know industry size in terms of adoption of these platforms. Certainly, there may be less use of multiple platforms, as we talked about today, where large organizations are looking to centralize and streamline the number of platforms. We saw that as a poll answer. But certainly at the smaller, mid-sized, smaller organization, they are, and they're not immune from regulation, right? Smaller broker dealers, smaller branch offices have the same obligations. So they're beholden to adhere to those, and they have to have the controls in place, are expected to have the controls in place, as they always have, whether it been email in the past or increasingly today around mobile communications and things like instant messaging.
Okay, so this is one rule applies to pretty much everybody. Excellent, thank you. So thank you to our audience for your questions and to our speakers for your answers. And I think we have time just to run a final poll. The question is, beyond compliance, what or would you expect to be the benefits of best practice e-com surveillance at your organization? Again, you can tick as many boxes as appropriate. And while you do that, let me ask Jordan how he sees the benefits of getting e-com surveillance right beyond compliance.
So beyond compliance, I think certainly productivity between the different teams. Enabling collaboration is key, and that's the main reason why these platforms exist in the first place, to get stuff done. There's obviously business opportunities that naturally come out of productivity, but also just thinking about the rich data that you would have in your organization if you get your archives, your captures, your archives, and your surveillance monitoring systems correct. That data set can be reviewed for potential different methods of revenue generation. You could effectively spin up a whole new business model based on that data set. The data belongs to you. If you get it right, there is potentially a lot of weight in that gold there. Having said that, getting it right does take a bit of time, and it does take finding the right solutions. And the other thing to add again is that it's critical to get it right, to refocus your team, to add value, to add higher value than just closing down false positives and fixing data issues as well.
Thank you. David, what would you say there?
Definitely culture in terms of the organization. If it's right, the organization as a whole knows it's being surveilled properly and thoroughly, and so it should have an impact on culture. But I think also the front office can start expecting compliance to be more proactive rather than digging around trying to find data. Compliance can turn to be more proactive with the front office, so the front office can start expecting taps on the shoulder from compliance to tell them how things are changing and what they need to watch out for, rather than being kind of very reactive.
Okay, that's excellent. Thank you both very much indeed. And let's see the poll results, if we may. And David, would you like to comment on these?
Yeah, I suppose it's kind of what you would expect to see in terms of productivity and improved compliance. So that's kind of where, and what we said about ethical e-coms adding to company culture. It's almost like I saw this beforehand. It kind of adds to it, right? You're not going to be getting compliance team members to sort of like dig around in the data. The e-coms surveillance solutions will do a lot more of the heavy lift. So the productivity goes up, and you get improved compliance, and that's kind of the trend that you should start seeing with these systems.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. And coming to the final item in today's webinar, I'd like to ask all our speakers to offer some advice to practitioners working on modern e-com surveillance. And coming back to you again, David, would you like to take the lead here?
Yeah, I'll keep it short. So I think from a compliance perspective and a compliance team perspective, recognition, firstly, that people can't do the heavy lift. And once you've recognized that, right, you start working out what your strategy is going to be for tackling surveillance. And then after that, work out what the key priority is to focus on as you start driving that e-com surveillance sort of project work.
Thank you very much. Jordan, what would your advice be?
No upcoming platform changes. We've talked about regulation changes a lot, but platform changes are quite crucial as well. Manage the data that's coming through, manage the integrity of that data. And I think finally, my last point would be move towards a risk behavior based detection model. You can still use your lexicons, you might want to use AI, but stay away from nouns and move on to adjectives and verbs, because those would get you a lot more true positives.
Thank you. And Garth, some final advice from you, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to everybody. I would say don't take an all or nothing approach. David talked about this in terms of, identify the problem you're looking to solve. So similarly, ripping and replacing, your entire surveillance system, your entire archive, migrating the data, all of this can be done, but the time to implement, the time to value, and the potential lost time for identifying risk is higher, right? So start sequentially, focus on the modality, whether it's voice, video, SMS, whatever that channel is that's a potential risk in your organization and is a pressing concern, and look for an approach that's going to integrate and take advantage of your existing IT infrastructure and your infrastructure investments. So you want something that's going to, whether it's a capture tool that's going to fit your existing surveillance system or a surveillance system that's going to plug in to your existing archive. Don't take an all or nothing approach. Start small. It's in a continuing journey, as we talked about today. Second point would be future-proof, right? We all see that things continue to evolve. This is a continuing technology journey. You might not be looking to, support video capture and monitoring and surveillance today, or fully embracing and utilizing assistive AI, depending on your culture and skill sets today, but you might be in the future. So the world changes quickly. From a technology standpoint, look at solutions that are future-proof. And the last piece of advice would be, don't get locked in, right? We saw this in the first iteration of cloud-based environments for surveillance and archive. Avoid solutions that are going to lock you into a proprietary storage model, that are going to pass their storage and operating costs onto you and potentially hold your data hostage, and where the switching fees are so immense that you're, for all intents and purposes, locked in as a recurring annuity to that provider. So avoid that by all means.
Okay, thank you, Garth, and thank you to all our speakers today for sharing their expertise and their experience. Thank you too to Theta Lake for sponsoring today's webinar. Before we close, just a few A-Team Group items that may be of interest to you. If you scroll down your screen, you'll see additional options where you can sign up for A-Team Group's forthcoming webinar on cross-regulation, data consistency and accuracy. You can also register for our 16th of November RegTech Summit in New York, where we'll be hosting a panel on surveillance. So if you're there, make sure you get to that one. Or indeed our 29th of November RegTech Summit in Singapore. That said, that's it for today. So thank you again to Garth, David and Jordan. And thank you to all of you who have taken part in the webinar. Please complete our feedback form, as we're always keen to hear your views and improve our products. Meantime, thanks again and goodbye.